As the war in Iran drags on, more and more people are debating why exactly this war is happening. Why did the United States start this war? Now, one common explanation that you hear from critics is that supposedly this is all about Israel. Benjamin Netanyahu convinced Donald Trump to attack Iran to save Israel on behalf of Israel. I do not find this argument very convincing. I think it is extremely superficial and it misses the forest for the trees. It reminds me of people who claim that the reason for World War I was that a Yugoslav nationalist assassinated Archduke Ferdinand, who was going to be the leader of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and this caused Austria-Hungary to declare war on Serbia, and it dominoed into a series of escalations that led to World War I. If you actually think that is the reason for World War I, you do not understand the conflict. World War I was an inter-imperialist war. The Western imperial powers had colonized pretty much all of the world. They had carved up most of the planet, and they had no more lands left to colonize. Therefore, the Western imperialist powers fought wars with each other over control of their colonies and the natural resources and the labor in their colonies so the other empires could exploit them. That actually helps us understand why World War I broke out. It was not all simply because of Serbia. Similarly today, the war that the US started against Iran is not just because of Israel. I'm not saying Israel's not a factor. Obviously, Israel is a factor, just like Serbia and the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand were also factors in World War I. But you have to have a bigger picture perspective to understand what the war is really about instead of focusing on the individual personalities and leaders. But it goes without saying that the US has been at war in the Middle East for decades. The war in Iran follows US wars on Iraq, 2 different wars on Iraq, war on Libya, war on Syria, war on Yemen. The list goes on and on. These wars were not all waged simply because of Israel. Now, yes, obviously, the US and Israel do want to control this region. They want to dominate this region and overthrow any independent government that challenges their domination. But why is that? Why is the US empire so obsessed with controlling this region? I mean, the answer is so obvious. Everyone knows. Oil. West Asia has the largest oil reserves on Earth by far. In fact, if you look at a list of the top 10 countries with the largest oil reserves, you can see that many of them are in this region and are involved in this war. Number 2 is Saudi Arabia. Number 3 is Iran itself. Number 5 is Iraq. Number 6 is the UAE. Number 7 is Kuwait. Number 9 is Libya, which the US waged war against in 2011. Number 8 is Russia, and the US has been waging a proxy war against Russia in Ukraine for years. Number 1 is Venezuela, and the Trump administration invaded Venezuela in January 2026 and kidnapped Venezuela's internationally recognized constitutional president, Nicolas Maduro. And Trump admitted that he wanted to take over Venezuela's oil. Oil is probably the single most important commodity for modern society. We could not have functioning modern societies without oil, which is why the US government has been weaponizing oil and trying to collapse Cuban society, to collapse Cuba's economy by imposing an oil blockade to prevent Cuba from importing oil, which is leading to massive blackouts. Cuba has had to shut down schools, even some medical centers. There's very little transportation. The US has imposed this suffocating oil blockade because the US understands how extremely important oil is to a modern economy. The US empire has weaponized oil. And for its part, the Iranian government also understands the critical importance of oil in this war, which is why in response to the war of aggression that the US launched against Iran, Tehran decided to shut down the Strait of Hormuz, which is the most important oil transit choke point on Earth. Every day, 20% of the global oil supply flows through this very narrow strait, and Iran shut it down. And this is why the global oil price has skyrocketed, And it's why Qatar's energy minister warned that this war could, quote, bring down the economies of the world, end quote. So it's obvious that the U.S. empire wants to control the oil reserves of this very important region. In fact, a top Trump administration official named Jared Ogden, who is the executive director of Trump's National Energy Dominance Council. That's the name of it. This is a council created by Trump, the National Energy Dominance Council. He admitted proudly in an interview on Fox News, which is basically state media, that the goal of this war in Iran is to take over the, quote, massive oil reserves in Iran, end quote. The Trump administration is proud of it. Again, they're not hiding that fact. However, now that I've established all of that, the centrality of oil in this war and other U.S. wars in West Asia, this raises another question. Why does the U.S. want to control all of this oil when you may know that the U.S. is actually the number one producer of oil on Earth by far? In fact, as of 2024, the U.S. made up 22% of global oil production, which is more than double the oil output of Saudi Arabia, which is the number 2 producer, and Russia, which is the number 3 producer. The United States is swimming in oil. So why does the U.S. also want to control the oil of Saudi Arabia and Venezuela and many other countries? Well, this brings us to the single most important issue, which is the U.S. dollar. The blood in the veins of the international financial system, the global reserve currency. This is the most powerful weapon that the U.S. empire has. Much more powerful than the U.S. military, which we can see right now. Iran is actually causing a lot of damage to the U.S. military. The U.S. can spend trillions of dollars on its military, but that's not the most important weapon that the U.S. empire has. It is the U.S. dollar. The fact that the United States is the only country on earth that can print the global reserve currency, and it prints a lot of dollars. And this gives the U.S. extreme power to, for instance, weaponize the international financial system by imposing unilateral sanctions that violate international law. But the U.S. has imposed unilateral sanctions on 1/3 of all of the countries on earth, according to the Washington Post, including 60% of low-income nations. So if you have a government that does something that the U.S. doesn't like, the U.S. can try to punish your country's entire economy by cutting off all of the banks from U.S.-dominated financial institutions like the SWIFT interbank messaging system. This is what the U.S. did to Russia and Iran. The U.S. can try to prevent your government from doing any transactions involving dollars, which makes it extremely difficult for your country to engage in the international financial system. This is exactly what Iran has suffered from for decades, ever since the Iranian people had a revolution in 1979 that overthrew a U.S. puppet dictator. However, in recent years, the power of the U.S. dollar system has been eroding as especially China and Russia, but also other countries are pushing for de-dollarization and are seeking alternatives to the U.S. dollar. This has terrified the U.S. empire, which is why Donald Trump himself has publicly threatened countries in BRICS, posting on his website Truth Social that any country in BRICS, any global South country that tries to challenge the global dominance of what Trump calls the mighty U.S. dollar was threatened with 100% tariffs. And Trump actually did impose 50% tariffs on multiple BRICS countries. And by the way, BRICS has been expanding in recent years beyond the original 5 members of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And in 2024, you know what country joined BRICS? Iran. Iran has been a major advocate for de-dollarization because it's been under illegal U.S. sanctions for decades. So Iran has been working with many countries to seek alternatives to the U.S. dollar. And Iran, in fact, proposed that BRICS should try to create a new global reserve currency, or at least a unit of account that trade partners could use to settle trade imbalances and to circumvent the U.S. dollar. Iran and some of its trading partners like Russia have also cut out the use of the US dollar in their bilateral trade, and instead they have been trading with their own local currencies. So this is a significant reason why the US empire has seen Iran as such a major threat to its global dominance. In addition to the fact, of course, that Iran has supported many resistance groups in the region fighting against US imperialism and Israeli colonialism. Iran has been the most important supporter of the axis of resistance. I'm not in any way trying to downplay that element, the geopolitical element, and the military element. These are all important factors. Every war has multiple reasons. There's not just one simple explanation for a war. But what I am saying here is that we should zoom out a bit and think about the larger long-term picture here. We need to understand why the US has been at endless war in West Asia, Iraq, Iran, Syria, Libya, Yemen, all of these countries. Why has the US been waging war for so long? I mentioned the answer, oil, but then I also talked about the dollar. So this might be confusing people. They're saying, wait, Ben, first you said it was about oil, then you said it was about the dollar. Which is it? Well, this is the real point to emphasize, which is these two are directly linked. And it's extremely important to understand the petrodollar system and why the US empire wants to control the global oil market. Because this helps us to understand how the US has been able to maintain the dollar as the global reserve currency, and how this has given the US the exorbitant privilege of being the only country that can issue the global reserve currency. It's because, again, oil is the single most important commodity for modern society. Without access to oil, modern societies would collapse, which is exactly what the US is doing to Cuba right now. Oil is the most important global commodity, and it's sold in dollars. And why is it sold in dollars? It's because the US government forced the countries of the Middle East, of West Asia, to sell their oil in dollars as part of the petrodollar system. And to understand this, we have to go back to the 1970s. In 1973, in response to another Israeli war of aggression, Saudi Arabia and the OPEC countries initiated an oil embargo to protest over Western support for Israel. This caused the price of oil to skyrocket. So in 1974, the US government, under President Richard Nixon, sent top US officials to Riyadh to sign a historic agreement. And this was discussed in a Bloomberg article in 2016 titled "The Untold Story Behind Saudi Arabia's 41-Year U.S. Debt Secret." This 1974 meeting in Saudi Arabia featured U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and U.S. Treasury Secretary Bill Simon, who was a Wall Street trader, and they were sent to Saudi Arabia in order to come to an agreement, and Bloomberg described the goal, quote, "Neutralize crude oil as an economic weapon and find a way to persuade a hostile kingdom to finance America's widening deficit with its newfound petrodollar wealth." Bloomberg pointed out that the U.S. government pressured Saudi Arabia to park their petrodollars in the U.S. financial system, in U.S. banks, and in the form of U.S. securities, U.S. financial assets. And the deal was very simple. This is how Bloomberg described it. Quote, "The U.S. would buy oil from Saudi Arabia and provide the kingdom military aid and equipment. In return, the Saudis would plow billions of their petrodollar revenue back into treasuries and finance America's spending," end quote. And until recently, until a decade ago when the U.S. massively increased its oil production and became the number one oil producer, before that, Saudi Arabia was the most important oil producer on earth. And because Saudi Arabia priced all of its oil sales in dollars, this meant that countries all around the world had to get dollars in order to buy oil. And this also meant that other commodities around the world were also sold in dollars. This maintained global demand for the US dollar. Every country on earth that needs oil, which by the way is every country, had to get dollars in order to pay for that oil. However, in the past few years, with de-dollarization, more and more countries are trying to buy oil in different currencies. And as of 2023, about 20% of global oil was sold in other currencies. This is primarily because Russia is now selling oil in other currencies, and this is due to the Western sanctions against Russia over the war in Ukraine. And Russia is one of the top 3 oil producers. So this is a pretty new development. However, although this is important, I should still emphasize that the inverse means that still 80% of global oil is sold in dollars. 80%. And that's basically all of the other oil producers except Russia and also Iran. Because for a decade now, Iran, which of course has been sanctioned by the West as well illegally, Iran has been selling its oil to China in China's currency, the renminbi or the yuan. And this is a report from 2012 in the BBC pointing out that China has been buying oil from Iran using its own currency, circumventing the US dollar. And you know which country was also selling its oil to China in yuan? Venezuela. In 2017, Venezuela started listing its oil prices in Chinese yuan, challenging the dominance of the US dollar. And this was in response to the illegal unilateral sanctions that the US imposed on Venezuela. In fact, the role of the petrodollar system was even mentioned by Reuters, the most mainstream of all mainstream Western media outlets, in an article in January 2026, just a few days after the Trump administration bombed Venezuela and kidnapped Venezuela's internationally recognized President Maduro. And Reuters published an article titled, "Trump's Venezuela Oil Grab Revives Petrodollar Debate." Well, now it's being openly discussed in the Western financial media, in large part because Donald Trump is no longer even hiding it. He is blatantly saying, yeah, we are waging wars against these countries to take over their oil. And Trump is openly threatening BRICS countries and saying, if you challenge the dominance of the US dollar, we will impose 100% tariffs on you and try to collapse your economy.